What if I told you the most feared king in English history once wore bird feathers, bathed in herbs, and believed onions cured colds? This isn't the Henry VIII from your dusty textbooks. This is the royal rollercoaster of gluttony, glitter, and complete absurdity. From jewel-studded dogs to wine-fueled hunts, we're diving into 99 of the most ridiculous facts about the monarch who ruled with a turkey leg in one hand and a codpiece the size of his ego. Strap in. History just got weird. Henry VIII owned over 230 pairs of gloves. If you thought your closet was a little excessive, meet Henry VIII, glove hoarder extraordinaire. This man owned over 230 pairs of gloves. Not work gloves, not gardening gloves. These were perfumed, embroidered, status symbol gloves. Many soaked in rosewater because apparently nothing says manly monarch like floral-scented fingertips. Why so many? Well, Henry wasn't about to shake hands with nobles while smelling like boar stew and anxiety. He wanted his handshake to be a bouquet of political dominance and delicate petal notes. Also, gloves were like the medieval Rolex. If you had them in enough varieties, you were rich, stylish, and probably not doing your own laundry. Henry even gifted gloves like modern influencers hand out merch. If your palms didn't smell faintly of luxury, were you even really in the Tudor inner circle? But gloves weren't enough. You know what goes great with 230 gloves? Reflective surfaces. Lots of them. He was obsessed with mirrors. Forget Instagram. Henry VIII invented the selfie. He just did it with oil paintings and an unhealthy addiction to mirrors. The man had dozens of them, and we're not talking tiny hand mirrors here. We're talking full length, gold framed, look at me from every royal angle masterpieces. He'd strut past, pause, admire, maybe flex a calf, then continue. Courtiers were expected to nod approvingly, preferably without snorting. This wasn't just vanity, it was brand management. Henry believed his appearance reflected divine right. If his codpiece looked heroic in the mirror, surely England was in safe hands. Mirrors were everywhere, palaces, chambers, even near his jousting gear. Rumour has it, he once delayed a council meeting because his reflection needed adjusting. And yet, despite all this reflection, he couldn't see it coming when he tried to wrestle the King of France. He once challenged the French king to a wrestling match and lost. Diplomacy, Tudor style. Two kings meet, share a feast, compliment each other's tights, then spontaneously engage in a shirtless wrestling match. Because nothing says international peace treaty like a surprise suplex. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, Henry, feeling pumped from compliments and probably meat pies, challenged King Francis I of France to a friendly wrestling bout. Spoiler, he lost, spectacularly. One moment, Henry was posturing with kingly bravado. The next, he was flat on the velvet grass, blinking up at the heavens and rethinking his life choices. The court gasped. The French smirked. The English pretended it didn't happen. Still, Henry brushed it off like a true monarch, by throwing more lavish parties and commissioning more mirrors. But his bruised ego would soon need something even shinier, perhaps armour, and not just for himself. Henry had custom-made armour for his horse, complete with a metal tail. Because if you're going to parade through court like a Renaissance action figure, your horse better look the part too. Henry VIII didn't just settle for a saddle and some polished reins. He commissioned custom-made armour for his horse. This wasn't just any armour. It included a fully articulated, gleaming metal tail. That's right, a metallic horsebutt flourish. Because nothing strikes fear into your enemies like being charged by a four-legged tank with a shiny behind. The whole setup wasn't about practicality, it was about intimidation and theatrical flair. Henry wanted his horse to look as unstoppable as he thought he was. There were engraved plates, gilded details, and enough shine to blind a jousting opponent from 50 yards. The armour weighed a ton, literally, and the poor horse probably needed a post-parade massage. And just in case the metal equestrian extravaganza wasn't dramatic enough, Henry liked to ride out in full matching armour too, man and beast, glinting in the sun like a mobile cathedral. And when he wasn't intimidating visitors with his steed's titanium tail, he was serenading his court with something else. He loved composing music. His best-known piece is Pastime with Good Company. Yes, the same man who executed wives, like some people change phone plans, also enjoyed writing music. Henry VIII, your friendly neighbourhood autocrat, was quite the composer. His most famous song, Pastime with Good Company, was basically the Tudor equivalent of a pop hit. He wrote it in his early 20s, full of optimism, hormones, and the belief that he was England's Beyoncé with a lute. The lyrics preach the joys of merrymaking and moral virtue, which is hilarious given his future marital resume. Still, the song was a hit in court. Courtiers sang it. Nobles copied it. Even peasants heard about it eventually, possibly through aggressively loud palace windows. Henry played the lute, the organ, and could carry a tune with the kind of gusto you'd expect from a man who wore bejeweled shoes. Pastime with Good Company wasn't just a melody, it was his public image campaign. See, I'm not a tyrant, I'm fun at parties. But when he wasn't crooning by candlelight, he was tinkering with something a little more alarming. He owned a mechanical lion that could roar. Nothing says I'm completely normal like owning a mechanical lion, built for court entertainment, or, depending on how well it worked, complete terror. Henry's mechanical lion could roar, move, and possibly traumatize anyone who got too close. It was a wind-up marvel of Tudor engineering, probably pulled on wheels and powered by a system of gears and ambition. Imagine being a courtier, half drunk on mead, when suddenly a metal beast trundles into the hall and bellows at you like a demonic kettle. That's Henry's idea of fun. Guests reportedly gasped, screamed, or applauded wildly, sometimes all three at once. Why a lion? Because lions were royal, fierce, and symbolic of strength, and because real ones were hard to come by without someone getting mauled. This fake lion could be controlled, paraded, and used to impress foreign dignitaries, or frighten visiting ambassadors into awkward diplomacy. Of course, it also served as a subtle reminder. If Henry can make a lion out of gears and roar it at you, what else is he capable of? But even with his mechanical zoo, nothing unnerved Henry more than one very real threat. Henry was terrified of disease, especially the sweating sickness. For a man who loved risk, jousting, overeating, and marrying dangerously opinionated women, Henry VIII had a crippling fear of one very particular thing: disease, especially the dreaded sweating sickness, a mysterious Tudor plague that could kill you faster than you could lace up your codpiece. If someone at court so much as sneezed, Henry was gone, evacuated to a remote hunting lodge, surrounded by herbs, and yelling at the walls to be scrubbed harder. He carried little pomanders filled with spices and perfumes, believing sweet smells could ward off illness. He rotated his courtiers constantly to avoid catching anything, and once refused to see his own advisors during an outbreak. Because governance is important, but not if someone's got the sniffles. Sweating sickness wasn't just a medieval flu. It came on fast, drenched its victims in cold sweat, and often killed them within a day. Henry's terror wasn't entirely irrational, just deeply melodramatic. He'd order the royal beds burned, linens destroyed, and halls fumigated with vinegar. Still, even in isolation, he had one thing to comfort him: a roasted bird that he thought would keep him strong and vigorous. He believed eating swan was good for virility. Swan, elegant, gliding symbol of grace, and in Henry's opinion, a feathered Viagra substitute. The man genuinely believed that eating swan meat could boost his virility, which is ironic considering he had 6 wives, and enough illegitimate children rumours to populate a reality show. But when you're a king with too much time, too much meat, and an obsession with performance, both on the battlefield and elsewhere, you'll try anything. Swan wasn't just for show. It was part of a carefully curated libido diet. The royal kitchens would serve it roasted, stuffed, or glazed, sometimes even plated in its own feathers, because subtlety was not on the Tudor menu. Henry believed in the power of food to affect the body, especially when the food looked like it belonged in a royal pond. Swans were rare, expensive, and required a royal license to cook, which meant, of course, he had dozens, probably waddling through the palace gardens, wondering who was next. And what do you wash down your sexy swan dinner with? Why, the Tudor health drink of choice, a gallon of ale. He drank about a gallon of ale a day, because water wasn't considered safe. Water. That stuff peasants drank before dysentery carried them off. Henry VIII wouldn't be caught dead with a goblet of plain old H2O. In Tudor times, water was widely mistrusted, often for good reason. Polluted rivers, stagnant wells, and general medieval hygiene made drinking water a gamble. So instead, everyone, from the baker's apprentice to his royal majesty, drank ale. But Henry, he didn't just sip, he guzzled. A gallon a day was typical, sometimes more. And we're not talking modern IPA-level alcohol. This was small ale, low on booze, high on calories, and basically Tudor Gatorade. Henry would start the day with ale, pair his meat pies with it, and likely brush his teeth in it if it didn't get his codpiece soggy. The result? A very hydrated, slightly tipsy monarch with a questionable digestive system. It also didn't help his waistline. But did that stop him from drinking it by the pitcher? Absolutely not. Because in Henry's world, ale was life, water was danger, and dinner wasn't complete unless it included a roast swan, a jug of ale, and a side of royal delusion. And speaking of drinks, have you ever seen a wine fountain made entirely of gold? Because Henry had one. Henry had a solid gold wine fountain at Hampton Court. Why pour wine like a mere mortal when you can have it gush from a fountain made entirely of gold? At Hampton Court, Henry VIII did just that. He commissioned a solid gold wine fountain because nothing says "please take me seriously as your ruler" like an endless stream of booze spurting from a shiny monument to excess. Guests could stroll by, goblet in hand, and refill from a golden tap as if they were casually visiting Dionysus. The fountain wasn't just a party trick, it was a statement. I am rich, I am powerful. I don't even have to ask for wine. It comes to me like a loyal subject. It reportedly flowed with claret during feasts, festivals, and any Tuesday, Henry felt particularly festive. Diplomats were impressed, courtiers were delighted, and the servants, probably stressed beyond belief, trying to clean fermented grape juice off gilded plumbing. The wine fountain was the centerpiece of a court where decadence was daily routine. But when the wine ran low and the boredom crept in, Henry had a foolproof cure: mandatory costume changes. He made his court play dress-up. They'd randomly wear disguises for fun. If you think your office's casual Friday is weird, imagine working at Henry VIII's court where, at any given moment, you might be ordered to dress like a peasant, a nun, or a mythical woodland creature. Because why govern an empire when you can host a medieval cosplay party? Henry loved a good masquerade, and not just for balls. On random evenings, he'd announce that everyone must appear in disguise. Nobles would scurry to grab masks, robes, and fake beards. The Duke of Norfolk might show up pretending to be a chimney sweep. Ladies of the court might dress as milkmaids or pirates. The entire royal court became a Shakespearean fever dream. It wasn't just frivolity, it was power play theatre. If Henry showed up as a masked shepherd and you failed to recognise him, or worse, failed to flatter him, you might wake up the next morning a little less employed or married. or alive. But sometimes Henry took his own disguise obsession a bit too far, especially when he decided to prank the very person he once swore to love and honour. Henry once wore a disguise to court and surprised everyone, including his queen. Imagine being Queen of England, attending a royal banquet, when suddenly a mysterious stranger bursts into the hall dressed like a Venetian merchant with questionable facial hair. He struts up, flirts, dances, maybe even sings a little lute tune, and then rips off the mask to reveal your husband, the king. Henry VIII was that guy. He once disguised himself so convincingly at court that not even his closest friends recognized him. The entire room was on edge. Who is this bold intruder daring to woo the Queen? Anne Boleyn, yes, that Queen, played along until the dramatic unmasking, at which point everyone gasped, laughed, and probably exhaled very, very hard. Henry considered it great sport. It made him feel youthful, theatrical, and above all, in control. And if the prank worked, he got a round of applause. If it backfired, well, someone might end up mysteriously reassigned to Ireland. The man didn't just rule by law, he ruled by spectacle. And when he wasn't shocking his court in disguise, he was crushing them in board games. Well, one board game in particular. His favourite board game was Nine Men's Morris. When Henry VIII wasn't chopping marital ties or composing love ballads, he was channeling his inner board game geek. His absolute favourite, Nine Men's Morris, a medieval strategy game that's basically tic-tac-toe's overachieving cousin. Played with black and white counters on a cross-hatch board, it requires cunning, patience, and just the right amount of regal gloating. Henry loved it so much. He had custom boards made from ivory, gold, and probably the bones of vanquished opponents. Kidding, hopefully. Courtiers were expected to play along, and lose gracefully, of course. Nothing tanked your royal standing faster than defeating the king and smirking about it. Henry wanted to win, and if he didn't, let's just say it might have been suggested you let him take another turn. Sometimes games took hours, stretching into evenings of ale-fueled drama. Bets were placed, cheating was whispered, and all the while, the king sat at the centre, cackling as he cornered your final piece. And when the game was over, the real entertainment began. Henry's beloved living chess pieces took the stage. He kept performing dwarfs and jesters at court, who were paid more than some nobles. Yes, while nobles starved for attention and actual food, Henry was busy giving raises to jesters and performers, especially dwarves, whom he often cast in elaborate performances and pageants. These entertainers weren't just background noise. They were stars. They were his living memes. They made him laugh, and in Henry's world, that meant you got paid handsomely. Some of these performers lived like minor royalty themselves. Fine clothes, generous food allowances, and the occasional gold trinket tossed in like a treat. Nobles grumbled, but Henry didn't care. If you could juggle flaming fruit while reciting Latin backwards, or make a witty joke about French fashion, you were in. If you were a duke with bad table manners, better luck next reign. One of his most famous jesters, Will Somers, had free rein to mock the king himself, something no noble would dream of doing and living. Somers could say what others whispered, all while wearing a ridiculous hat. Power through parody. But even the jester's motley couldn't compete with the real centerpiece of Henry's wardrobe. The item so grand it got its own velvet, his codpiece. He had a custom velvet codpiece and reportedly stuffed it for appearance. Let's talk about the most gloriously unnecessary item in Tudor fashion, Henry VIII's custom velvet codpiece. Not content with gold-threaded doublets and fur-lined cloaks, Henry turned his attention to the fabric pouch covering his royal legacy. And like everything else in his wardrobe, it had to be big, bold, and vaguely terrifying. Made from rich velvet and often jewel-encrusted, the codpiece was more billboard than garment. This wasn't subtle. This was weaponized fashion. It screamed, "I am virile, I am mighty, I require architectural support," and according to court whispers and possibly traumatized tailors, Henry stuffed it to exaggerate the effect, because nothing says confidence like theatrical upholstery. Foreign ambassadors wrote about it, portraits couldn't ignore it. Some suits of armour from his reign even featured an absurdly prominent metal codpiece that could double as a bird perch. It wasn't just clothing, it was propaganda in velvet form. But for Henry, it was all part of the image. Strong king, fertile king, codpiece king, and when your calves and crotch were your best assets, you made sure everyone noticed. Speaking of calves, his were so magnificent they practically had their own fan club. Henry had a multiple toothpicks made of ivory and wore them on a gold chain. In case you thought Henry VIII's obsession with appearances ended at wardrobe and wine fountains, let's talk dental hygiene, Tudor style. The king had multiple toothpicks, not wooden ones, not disposable ones, ivory ones, carved, polished and carried around his neck like dental bling. Because nothing says I care about my smile like dangling a tiny elephant tusk from your royal neck. He wore these fancy toothpicks on a gold chain as both a fashion statement and a hygiene tool. After devouring half a roasted boar and a pie the size of a toddler, Henry would whip out one of his dainty tools and go to work, possibly while still at the banquet table. Floss was centuries away, but the king wasn't about to let a leg of lamb ruin his majestic grin. This was less about oral health and more about showing off. Ivory toothpicks were rare, expensive, and completely extra, which is exactly how Henry liked to live. He was a monarch with the taste of a sultan and the dietary habits of a bear. And speaking of parts he liked to show off, he was extremely proud of his calves. His courtiers complimented them constantly. Forget the royal face or the kingly intellect. Henry VIII's true pride and joy? His calves. Yes, those mighty Tudor drumsticks were the object of near-religious devotion at court. He strutted around in hose so tight, you'd think they were painted on, all to showcase his well-formed lower legs. They were described in official records as remarkably shapely, noble, and impressively meaty, which raises questions about how often royal scribes had to stare at them. Courtiers were expected to compliment them regularly, and they did, out of flattery, fear, or perhaps genuine admiration for a man who could turn legs into a political advantage. Ambassadors noted them, portraits emphasized them. Even Henry's enemies begrudgingly admitted the man had game from the knee down. It got to the point where his tailor was asked to subtly lift hem lengths just to give those calves the spotlight they deserved. And if anyone dared suggest someone else's legs were better, off with their compliments, possibly off with their head. But if you think Henry's vanity stopped at his calves, wait until you see what he did with his armour, especially the area just a little higher up. His armour had a bizarrely large codpiece, likely exaggerated for show. If his velvet codpiece was attention-seeking, his armour's codpiece was a full-blown ego parade. Historians still blink in disbelief when they see it, jutting out like a metallic horn of overcompensation, polished to a gleam, and possibly aerodynamic. It wasn't just large, it was laughably large, and you better believe that was on purpose. Henry's ceremonial armour featured a codpiece so absurd, it became the stuff of legend, crafted with care, puffed to theatrical dimensions, and often engraved with patterns that dared the viewer to look away. It was medieval masculinity in weaponized form. Some scholars say it was a symbol of virility. Others suggest it was a form of armour satire. Most agree it was probably a little padded. To the Tudors, everything was a message. And this was a screaming, polished metal announcement. I am king. I am potent, and you will remember my groin. It's no wonder modern museum goers still do double takes. But Henry wasn't just about strutting and shining. he also needed a hobby to show off his coordination and competitive spirit. So naturally, he built himself a personal tennis court, indoors of course. Henry built an indoor tennis court at Hampton Court. Long before Wimbledon, Henry VIII was serving royal sass on his very own indoor tennis court, right at Hampton Court Palace. Why indoor? Because rain was for peasants. The king couldn't risk slipping on wet gravel and spraining a calf that had its own reputation to maintain. So he commissioned a glorious covered court where he could lob balls, swing rackets, and grunt like a champion without worrying about the weather or, governing. This wasn't your average rec centre court either. It had high walls, spectators' galleries, and probably a throne disguised as a bench for breaks. Henry took the game seriously, often playing for hours and insisting on absolute silence while he lined up a shot. If you distracted him, best case scenario, royal stink eye. Worst case, you're playing backgammon in exile. He wore custom tennis attire, of course, flowing sleeves, jewelled cuffs, and probably a codpiece with extra bounce. It wasn't about fitness, it was about dominance. Henry didn't just want to win. He wanted his opponent to lose so badly, they apologised for existing. But after tennis came grooming. And if you showed up with facial hair, you better hope Henry was in a good mood. He banned beards, then later taxed them, depending on his mood. Henry VIII had a complicated relationship with beards. Some days, he adored them. Other days, they were public enemy number one. He would literally wake up and declare, "No more beards." And courtiers would scramble for razors. Then, a few months later, he'd stroll into court, stroking his own chin fluff like a Renaissance lumberjack and announce a beard tax. Yes, a tax. As in, you want to keep that stylish stubble? Pay up. This wasn't just an early version of hipster suppression. It was cash flow with a side of vanity. The royal treasury loved it. The bearded population, not so much. His courtiers learned to play it safe, grow it, shave it, grow it again, all depending on which way the royal wind was blowing. Some nobles even tried to preemptively bribe barbers just to stay ahead of the decree. The real irony? Henry himself rocked a beard more than once. But when you're king, rules are like ex-wives, easy to make, easier to break. Still, one thing that never changed was his hunger for knowledge, or at least for books that made him look knowledgeable. He owned over 6,500 books, many handwritten with his own notes in the margins. Despite his love of wine fountains and velvet codpieces, Henry VIII was, surprisingly, a bit of a bookworm. He owned over 6,500 volumes, some printed, many handwritten, and several scrawled with his personal notes, like a Tudor professor who moonlighted as a monarch. And these weren't just cookbooks and gossip scrolls, though let's be honest, there were probably a few of those too. His collection included theology, politics, medicine, music, and because of course, books about how great kings are. Henry read in Latin and French and fancied himself a scholar. He'd underline phrases, argue in the margins, and occasionally doodle royal symbols like a bored schoolboy with absolute power. Some books even have his fingerprints preserved in ink, literal historical smudges of ego. He saw books as tools of authority. Knowledge, after all, is power, and if that power came bound in leather with gold leaf pages, even better. His private library became a statement. Look how smart I am, and also I can kill you with a signature. And when he wasn't reading or scribbling on sacred texts, he was doing something far less intellectual, like using archery to assault kitchen staff. Henry once shot arrows at a cook's hat just to show off his archery skills. Imagine preparing the royal dinner, minding your own business, when suddenly the King of England takes aim at your headwear. That's what happened when Henry VIII, feeling particularly Robin Hood-ish, decided to show off his archery skills by using a cook's hat as a makeshift bullseye. because nothing spices up kitchen morale like flying arrows and casual workplace endangerment. To be fair, the cook wasn't wearing the hat at the time, though knowing Henry, that was probably a very recent development. This wasn't an execution, it was entertainment. A royal flex. Henry loved demonstrating his prowess, and archery was one of the few things he was genuinely good at. The court was expected to marvel at his aim and pretend this wasn't an HR nightmare in the making. Courtiers applauded. The cook, hopefully, got a new hat. And Henry got the satisfaction of knowing his dinner prep staff now feared him not just for his temper, but for his deadly accuracy with a longbow. But for a man so obsessed with shooting stationary objects, he was even more obsessed with hunting things that ran away. He was obsessed with hunting, sometimes going out for 14 hours a day. If you thought Henry VIII had important things to do, governing, lawmaking, not marrying his cousin's niece, you'd be wrong. Because when it came to priorities, hunting trumped all. The man was obsessed. He didn't just dabble in the hunt like a bored noble with a weekend free. No, Henry would go out into the forest for 14 hours straight, chasing deer like his throne depended on it. This wasn't some quiet walk through the woods. It was a full-blown royal production. Trumpets, horses, a fleet of dogs, and dozens of unlucky servants hauling snacks and spare crossbows. He'd ride through field and forest, sweating through velvet, while courtiers pretended to enjoy being dragged through bramble for hours on end. The kill wasn't even the point. It was the ritual, the spectacle, the bragging rights of returning to court covered in mud, blood, and triumph. Henry believed hunting proved his masculinity, his vitality, and probably his eligibility for yet another annulment. And when he wasn't hunting for hours, he was racking up kills like a man on a very medieval leaderboard. He reportedly hunted at least 200 deer in a single year. You know who had a worse year than Anne Boleyn in 1536? Deer. Because Henry VIII reportedly hunted at least 200 of them in just 1 year. That's not a hobby, that's a venison massacre. Forests trembled when they heard the royal hunting party approach. Fawns packed their tiny bags. Bucks changed their names. This wasn't for survival or even royal banquets. It was for sport, status, and the joy of proving he was still England's alpha predator. Henry kept count, like it was fantasy football for forest domination. Every kill was a notch on his ego, another symbol of vigour. And the best part, he didn't even do all the dirty work. He had an entire team of courtiers whose sole job was to clap every time he loosed an arrow, vaguely in the right direction. By the end of a good hunting season, the royal kitchens were swimming in venison, and Henry was strutting around court like a man who had personally tamed nature. But even nature couldn't prepare itself for his next bizarre innovation, a kitchen gadget so strange it involved meat, machinery, and a treadmill dog. He invented a mechanical spit for roasting meat, powered by a dog on a treadmill. Why settle for human labour when you can put a dog on a treadmill and call it innovation? Henry VIII, ever the forward thinker in wildly unnecessary ways, invented a mechanical spit for roasting meat. The twist? It was powered by an unfortunate dog running endlessly in place like a medieval peloton class, except sweatier and with more venison. These so-called turnspit dogs were specially bred to be small, strong, and doomed. They'd run inside a wheel attached to a gear system that rotated a spit over the fire. The dog ran, the meat spun, and Henry got his perfectly roasted leg of something without breaking a royal sweat. Animal cruelty laws wouldn't come around for a few centuries, so this was seen as peak culinary tech. Of course, Henry wasn't just showing off his mechanical genius. This was about making sure dinner was cooked just right. If a dish wasn't roasted to perfection, heads might not roll, but certainly stomachs would grumble. Still, even with perfectly roasted meat, Henry didn't trust his food entirely. Which brings us to the most paranoid role in the royal kitchen. Henry had a food taster to prevent poisoning, but he still refused vegetables. Paranoia, thy name is Henry. The man had a designated food taster, someone whose sole job was to eat before him and hopefully not die. Every dish was sampled in advance, while Henry watched, possibly with one eyebrow raised, and a goblet at the ready. If the taster keeled over, well, time to call the backup chef. If not, dinner was served. But here's the kicker. Despite all this, Henry still refused to eat vegetables. That's right, Mr. Health and Safety wouldn't touch a leafy green. He believed vegetables were dangerous, unhealthy, and generally beneath royal digestion. Give him a mountain of meat, yes. A roasted swan, absolutely. But a salad? Treason. So while his food taster braved soups and sauces for signs of poison, the king nibbled meat pies and devoured poultry, avoiding anything green like it owed him money. Some claim his aversion was medical. Others say it was pure Tudor stubbornness. Either way, it probably explains his chronic constipation and general mood. But hey, if your insides are a mess, at least your outside should sparkle, and Henry made sure of that. By never wearing the same thing twice. He never wore the same outfit twice. Each was custom made and jewelled. Some people do laundry. Henry VIII just summoned a new wardrobe every single day. He never wore the same outfit twice. Not for banquets, not for battles, not even for walks in the garden while loudly judging the roses. Each garment was custom made, embroidered, jewelled, and layered with enough fabric to clothe a small village. We're talking silks from Italy, velvets from France, furs from creatures you've never heard of, buttons made of pearls, sleeves so wide you could shelter under them in a storm. Even his undergarments were probably fancier than your wedding outfit. Tailors were kept on retainer, churning out outfits with exhausting speed and terrified precision. Each morning, he was dressed by attendants, because buttoning that much opulence is at least a 3-person job. And heaven forbid a doublet be repeated. Fashion wasn't a detail, it was strategy. Henry dressed like a god on earth because he believed kingship had to look divine. So while courtiers wore hand-me-downs and peasants wore mud, Henry glittered like a chandelier on legs. And as if that weren't enough height, he also wore shoes with hidden platforms to literally look down on everyone else. He wore shoes with platforms inside to look taller than his courtiers. When you're already King of England, but still feel the need to one-up everyone, literally, you commission shoes with built-in platforms. Henry VIII was a tall man by Tudor standards, but that didn't stop him from padding the stats. His custom footwear came with secret lifts, allowing him to tower even more imposingly over his court, like a bejeweled skyscraper with anger issues. These weren't clunky Frankenstein boots either. No, these were finely crafted, velvet-covered, gold-buckled power shoes that gave just enough extra height to make the Duke of Suffolk rethink his posture. Standing taller wasn't just about ego. It was politics. The taller the king, the more dominant the photo op. Or in this case, the tapestry. Imagine entering court to give a report on trade tariffs, only to realise the king has silently grown 2 inches since yesterday. Do you mention it? Of course not. You simply bow lower and pretend not to notice the sound of creaking leather lifts. And speaking of things you're not supposed to notice, let's talk about Henry's golden approach to hygiene. He had gold-threaded toilet paper, or at least cloths of gold to wipe with. Yes, you read that right. When Henry VIII did his royal business, he wiped like a monarch with cloths of gold. Historians still debate whether it was literal cloth, woven with gold thread, or just absurdly luxurious fabric with a fancy name. Either way, the takeaway is clear. Henry was not about that scratchy peasant paper life. In the Tudor world, toilet paper as we know it didn't exist. Nobles used cloths, moss, hay, or whatever vaguely absorbent item was lying around. But not Henry. He had special cloths made, soft, shimmering, and almost certainly handled by terrified attendants, whose entire job was royal bottom logistics. This wasn't hygiene. This was performance. Even in the most private, least photogenic moments, Henry needed to feel rich, powerful, and presumably well exfoliated. He literally wiped his royal rear with wealth, but even gold-threaded toiletry didn't make him feel truly continental. So he tried something very French, a beard. Henry once tried to grow a beard like Francis I of France, but gave up halfway. Francis I of France was the cool kid of European royalty, stylish, suave, and sporting a lush Renaissance beard that could start a fan club. Henry VIII, ever the insecure overachiever, decided he too would grow a mighty beard to match his rival. It started well enough, some chin scruff, a little stubble flare, but somewhere around the awkward itchy stage, he gave up. No dramatic statement, no formal proclamation, he just stopped. The beard experiment ended, and the face of England returned to its glossy, well-oiled default. Perhaps Anne Boleyn wasn't a fan. Perhaps the court jesters laughed a little too hard. Or perhaps Henry looked in one of his many mirrors and thought, actually, no. The half-beard era passed into court gossip as another one of Henry's glorious failures, filed neatly between that time he wrestled a French king and invented treadmill dog spit. But not to worry. If he couldn't outbeard Francis, he'd outshine him another way, like building a parade float of himself, life-sized, for public display, because subtlety is for peasants. He had a parade float of himself built for public processions. If you're Henry VIII, the mirrors just aren't cutting it anymore, what do? You build a life-sized parade float of yourself, because nothing says humble servant of the realm like a giant rolling effigy of your own glorious face, probably with movable arms and a codpiece large enough to require its own axle. This wasn't just a one-off vanity stunt. This was a royal branding campaign on wheels. The float would roll through cheering crowds during festivals and coronations, decked out in glittering armour, velvet robes, and possibly waving like a mechanical messiah. Was it tacky? Oh, absolutely. Did people cheer anyway? Of course, they valued their necks. It served two purposes: intimidate foreign dignitaries and remind the common folk that their king was not only majestic, but also scalable. Henry turned himself into a literal icon. And if anyone asked why it existed, the answer was simple: because I can. But when he wasn't turning himself into rolling sculpture, he was proving that behind all the pomp, there was a genuinely skilled musician ready to impress, or at least jam. Henry played the recorder, lute and organ quite well. Yes, believe it or not, beneath the armour, layers of fur and codpiece theatrics, Henry VIII had the soul of a Renaissance boy band. He played the recorder with surprising finesse, strummed the lute like a courtly heartthrob, and tickled the organ keys with real musical talent. If TikTok had existed in the 1500s, he'd have gone viral for his brooding lute solos and dramatic madrigal covers. Henry wasn't just dabbling. He practiced, composed, and even jammed with professional musicians at court. Think royal jam sessions with wine flowing, jesters flailing, and the king in the middle playing something deeply romantic, while side-eyeing every noble in the room. You were expected to praise it, loudly, and on beat. Courtiers who sang off-key probably disappeared on hunting trips, and heaven help you if you requested a different song. Henry's playlist was the playlist. Still, even with all that music in his soul, the man could never resist the ultimate test of royal manliness, jousting, especially when his doctors begged him not to. He loved jousting so much that he ignored doctors' orders after a near-fatal injury. Some people can't take a hint. Henry VIII couldn't take a direct medical order screamed into his face after a brutal jousting accident left him unconscious for hours. possibly with a traumatic brain injury. His doctors gently suggested that perhaps, just maybe, he should stop flinging himself at other armoured men on horseback. Henry's response? Nah, he adored jousting, the clanging armour, the cheering crowds, the excuse to stab someone without a war. It was pure royal ecstasy. His armour was gilded. His horses were practically sequined. His lances were custom-sized to ensure dramatic shattering. After his accident, he suffered chronic leg pain and ulcers. But did that stop him? Of course not. He simply limped into the arena with twice the swagger and half the stability. It was no longer about sport. It was personal. Henry wanted to prove he was still virile, still powerful, still the man. Even as his courtiers whispered and his doctors wept into their leeches, Henry clung to his joust pole like it was a scepter. And if jousting in white silk sounded like a bad idea, Henry had already done that too, and looked fabulous. He once held a jousting tournament dressed entirely in silver and white silk. Most people wear armour to a joust. You know, metal, protective, useful when people are aiming spears at your chest, but not Henry VIII. No, he once decided to host a jousting tournament while dressed head to toe in silver and white silk. Because why not mix full contact medieval combat with the fragile elegance of a wedding tablecloth? The outfit shimmered, it sparkled, it fluttered dramatically in the breeze as he charged down the lists like a very well-funded ghost. Courtiers gasped, ambassadors took notes, and tailors probably sobbed at the thought of mending torn silk after a lance hit its mark. But that was the point. Henry didn't just want to win. He wanted to blind his opponent with beauty before knocking them off their horse. This was more fashion show than tournament. He was there to impress, stun, and remind everyone that he could outjoust you and outdress you. And if the judges awarded points for shine, he would have retired undefeated. When the jousts ended, the theatrics didn't. He just swapped the armour for costumes, because next up on the agenda, everyone dresses as shepherds. His court often held masquerade balls with bizarre themes. One involved dressing as shepherds. When your king owns a wine fountain and a parade float of himself, regular parties just won't cut it. So Henry threw masquerade balls that can only be described as historical fever dreams. One particularly memorable theme: shepherds. Yes, the most powerful men and women in England, dressed up as rustic farmhands with crooks and imaginary sheep, frolicking under silk-draped ceilings while Henry giggled into his goblet. This wasn't a costume suggestion, it was a royal command, and nobody disobeyed the dress code. You showed up in a shepherd outfit, or you danced alone in exile. Everyone wore fake beards, smocks, and flower crowns while pretending to chase invisible lambs around the ballroom. Somewhere in the chaos, you might catch the king himself dressed as a humble cowherd, except with way more rhinestones and a jewel-encrusted shepherd's staff. It was weird, extravagant, and deeply symbolic of Henry's favourite thing. Control with a side of absurdity. The message was clear. He could turn his court into anything he wanted, even a wool-themed pageant. And while the nobles were busy pretending to herd livestock, Henry had other strange ideas brewing, like how to cure a cold. With vegetables on your feet. Henry believed rubbing onions on your feet could cure colds. Move over chicken soup. Henry VIII had his own home remedy for the sniffles: onions. On your feet. According to his royal logic, rubbing sliced onions on your soles before bed would draw out the illness, because obviously that's how anatomy works. Germs, after all, are terrified of root vegetables and royal toes. No Tudor physician dared question this technique. If the king wanted his feet massaged with alliums, then by all means, fetch the onions and prepare the royal slippers. His attendants were expected to apply the pungent poultice with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Imagine being the guy who rubbed a sweaty king's feet with vegetables and called it medicine. That was somebody's career. The real kicker? Henry hated vegetables on his plate, but loved them smeared across his extremities. He avoided onions in his food, yet had no problem having them absorb humours through his skin like medieval osmosis. And if the onion foot treatment didn't do the trick, no problem. He'd just order his portrait retouched to look healthier, younger, and much less like a man who smelled like soup from the ankles down. He had portraits of himself altered to look younger and slimmer. Before Photoshop, there was Henry VIII's paintbrush diplomacy. The king didn't just sit for portraits, he micromanaged them like a Renaissance art director with body image issues. As he aged, widened, and ulcered, his official images mysteriously remained youthful, lean, and powerful. His waistline ballooned, but on canvas, chiseled jaw, heroic stance, calves that could crush rebellions. He personally oversaw artists like Hans Holbein, giving not-so-subtle direction, make me look strong, regal, and like I haven't eaten 12 swans this week. The result? A carefully curated fantasy version of Henry, one that terrified enemies and seduced wives, even when the real man was wheezing through a velvet tunic. Foreign princesses received these flattering oil lies as a preview of their future husband. Anne of Cleves famously agreed to marry based on her Henry-approved portrait. Then she met him in person. The shock was so great, even he called the wedding off. But hey, if you can't smell the deception in the paint, that's on you. Speaking of smells, Henry had very specific opinions about them, especially when it came to dogs. Henry hated the smell of wet dog, even though he had dozens of hunting hounds. Henry VIII adored hunting. He loved the chase, the kill, and oddly enough, the hats. But the aftermath, not so much. Particularly the olfactory horror of wet dog. Despite keeping dozens, yes, dozens, of prized hunting hounds, Henry couldn't stand their soggy scent. If a spaniel trotted in post-hunt with damp fur and enthusiasm, Henry's nose would wrinkle like he'd just caught a whiff of treason. It was an unsolvable paradox. He needed dogs to hunt, but he wished they'd arrive scent-free, dry, and possibly perfumed. Servants were tasked with keeping the royal hounds clean, brushed, and, when possible, less dog-like. Some records suggest dogs were even dried with linen cloths and dusted with herbs before they were allowed near the king. One can only imagine the chaos when a slobbery pup decided to shake off in the throne room. But Henry had a plan to combat this pungent problem. Overwhelm the smell with something even stronger, something regal, something handcrafted. He created his own perfume blend, which included ambergris and rose. Yes, the man who once used onions as medicine also dabbled in perfumery. Henry VIII wasn't about to let anyone else control how royalty smelled, so he concocted his own signature scent, a bold blend of ambergris, whale vomit, but the fancy kind, and rose. Why ambergris? Because it was rare, absurdly expensive, and smelled like old luxury and sea dragons. He layered it with roses to soften the blow, because nothing says I rule with an iron fist, like smelling faintly of a wedding bouquet. His perfumers crafted this olfactory masterpiece in secret chambers, probably while dodging hunting dogs and codpiece fittings. This wasn't just vanity, it was strategy. Henry used scent as part of his personal aura. You didn't just see the king, you smelled his authority wafting through the court halls like floral monarchy. Ambassadors noticed, courtiers praised it, and peasants, they probably just sneezed and wondered what died in the moat. And when Henry wasn't bottling his majesty, he was belting it, literally, at mealtime, with songs he made up on the spot. He was known to make up songs on the spot and sing them during meals. Picture this. You're mid-meat pie, chewing carefully because you know the king is watching, when suddenly, bam, Henry VIII breaks into song. No warning, no accompaniment, just the king himself, standing up with a goblet of ale in one hand and a leg of turkey in the other, belting out improvised lyrics about love, honour, or possibly how great his calves look today. Henry was notorious for his spontaneous musical numbers during meals. He'd tap his goblet, hum a tune, and then let the lyrics fly. Sometimes poetic, sometimes absurd, occasionally just sounds with enthusiasm. Courtiers would laugh, cheer, or join in if they wanted to keep their estates. If you didn't applaud, well, you'd better hope you enjoyed your meal, because it might be your last one at court. And yes, these songs were sometimes about his food, or his wives, or random political shade disguised as melody. Henry didn't need a lute, he was the instrument. And when the royal voice needed rest, what better way to unwind than toppling a few pins in his custom-built alley? Henry built a private bowling alley for himself and his favourites. While most kings settled for hawking, or maybe a good game of chess, Henry VIII demanded more thrilling indoor sports, so he built his very own private bowling alley. Yes, long before the smell of rental shoes and soggy nachos filled modern alleys, Henry was striding down polished Tudor lanes in silk stockings, flinging balls at pins like it was a matter of state. This wasn't a public bowling night. Only his most trusted companions were invited. These matches were high stakes, maybe not politically, but definitely socially. You wanted to let the king win, but not too obviously. You wanted to laugh at his jokes, but not too hard. And if he bowled a strike, you clapped like he'd just defeated France. The alley itself was luxurious, wood-panelled, candle-lit, and scented with crushed herbs to mask the smell of sweaty competition. Of course, the king wouldn't sit on any ordinary bench between frames. That's where the gold pillows came in. He had gold-embroidered pillows just for his feet. Because nothing says divine right of kings, like placing your royal feet on pillows fancier than most wedding dresses. Henry VIII had custom pillows embroidered with gold thread, specifically for propping up his feet. These weren't reused or borrowed from the throne room. These were purpose-built foot cushions, you know, for resting those famous calves after a long day of bowling, singing, and executing. Everywhere Henry went, so did his foot pillows. To court, to bedchambers, possibly even to the loo. Servants carried them like sacred relics, fluffing them up, repositioning them, and ensuring they always matched the decor. Why? Because a royal foot must never suffer the indignity of touching wooden floors like a commoner. It's likely some poor artisan spent weeks stitching tiny lions, crowns, and coats of arms into the corners. Also, Henry could absent-mindedly squash it under a velvet slipper, and if a courtier dared glance at those glorious pillows with envy, off to the tower, or at least the bowling alley gutter. And while his feet were pampered in luxury, his taste buds were chasing something a bit unusual. Ever heard of eggs boiled in beer? Henry swore by it. He liked his eggs boiled in ale. Breakfast with Henry VIII wasn't just a meal. It was a challenge to culinary common sense. Take, for example, his preferred method of preparing eggs. Boiled in ale. Because water, too bland, too peasant. If it didn't come with hops and the faint taste of bar brawl, Henry wasn't interested. Every morning, the royal kitchen prepared his eggs by gently simmering them in a warm bath of beer. The result? Something between a Tudor hangover cure and a protein-packed pub special. It wasn't just a quirky choice, it was practically medicinal in Henry's mind. Ale was seen as cleaner than water, full of strength-giving calories, and, most importantly, regal enough to bathe his breakfast. One can only imagine the royal flatulence that followed, but no one dared mention it. If the king wanted barley-boiled eggs, the court would nod, smile, and pretend that wasn't the weirdest thing happening before 9 a.m. And when he wasn't spicing up his breakfast, he was accessorizing. With garters, sparkly ones. Henry wore diamond-studded garters. not just for decoration, but also luck. Henry VIII didn't just wear garters, he weaponized them with diamonds. These weren't hidden under trousers or subtly peeking out at court. No, these glittering garters were part fashion statement, part superstition, and all royal swagger. Legend says he believed they brought good luck, especially during battles, jousts, and dice games, which, to Henry, were all basically the same thing. They were encrusted with gems, likely heavy enough to bruise a thigh, and definitely extravagant enough to make even the wealthiest nobles feel underdressed. You might think garters are a private garment. Not for Henry. He made sure they were seen, appreciated, and whispered about. Did you catch a glimpse of the king's ankle bling? Was practically Tudor gossip gold, and you better not compliment them too much. Henry might think you were plotting to steal his lucky leg ribbons. But while he adorned himself with diamonds and flirted with breakfast beer, there was one creature he absolutely did not vibe with. Cats. He hated cats, believing them to be associated with witchcraft. While dogs got jewel-studded collars and courtly affection, cats were banned from Henry's inner circle. Why? Because in true medieval fashion, he believed they were little furry agents of witchcraft. Black cats especially were seen as devilish spies, and Henry, ever the paranoid alpha male, wanted none of their mysterious feline energy anywhere near his crown. Rumour has it he once ordered a black cat removed from court because it stared at him too long. It probably blinked, maybe yawned. That was enough for a royal inquisition. He equated them with bad omens, curses, and, perhaps worst of all, disobedience. Cats don't take orders, and Henry did not appreciate creatures that ignored his divine authority. So while witches were being accused across Europe, Henry was keeping his court dog-friendly, cat-free, and absolutely soaked in perfume. Speaking of perfume, the man once lined his coat with dyed blue squirrel fur. Why? Because obviously, he had a coat lined with squirrel fur dyed blue. When you're King of England and already drowning in gold, jewels, and decorative armour, you eventually ask the question, but what if I wore squirrels? And not just any squirrels, blue ones. Henry VIII had a coat lined with the squirrel fur that had been dyed a luxurious, almost absurdly unnecessary shade of blue. Because natural colours are for peasants, and Henry preferred his fashion choices to scream, "Yes, I hunted Narnia." Squirrel fur, believe it or not, was actually a prized material in Tudor England. Soft, warm, and plentiful. Perfect for those chilly palace corridors. But dyeing it blue? That was peak royal extra. It wasn't for camouflage, warmth, or comfort. It was for style and intimidation. Nothing says, I have too much money and not enough boundaries, like flamboyant rodent couture. Courtiers pretended it was totally normal. Tailors probably cried. Foreign envoys wrote concerned letters home. Meanwhile, Henry paraded through court like a fashion-forward forest god, twirling dramatically so everyone got a glimpse of his electric blue lining. But even this furry masterpiece had nothing on his go-to power move. Dressing like a tomato. His favourite colour was red, and he wore it often to show power and virility. Henry VIII didn't just like red. He wore it like it was part of his royal anatomy. To him, red wasn't a colour, it was a message. A giant wool-dyed, jewel-encrusted declaration. I am strong, I am fertile, and I could ruin your family with one royal glare. He wore crimson doublets, scarlet cloaks, ruby-stoned rings, and blood-coloured boots. If he could have dyed his turkey legs red, he probably would have. Red symbolised dominance, vitality, and fire. And let's be honest, Henry wanted to look like he'd just stepped off the battlefield, or out of a particularly passionate painting. It didn't matter if it clashed with the drapes, or made him look like an overripe strawberry. When Henry walked into a room in full red regalia, everyone knew exactly who was in charge. And if they forgot, he'd remind them, possibly with a dance. Henry once tried to outdance a group of French ambassadors to impress them. When diplomacy got dull, Henry made it fabulous. During one particularly extravagant event with visiting French ambassadors, Henry VIII decided the best way to impress them wasn't with policy or poetry, but with dance. Yes, the King of England, in all his codpiece glory, leapt into the centre of the room and attempted to outboogie an entire delegation. He spun, he twirled, he pointed his toes like his kingdom depended on it. The French, famous for their own flair, stood wide-eyed as the red-clad monarch tried to pirouette his way into their favour. One ambassador may have clapped, another possibly looked for the nearest exit. It was part charm offensive, part workout routine, and 100% spectacle, and while no one officially declared a winner, Henry certainly crowned himself the champion, of course. But physical movement was also medicine in Henry's eyes, especially when paired with something a bit slippery, goose fat, anyone. He believed rubbing goose. Fat on your chest could cure coughs. Why bother with herbs or rest when you can slather yourself in poultry grease? Henry VIII, master of medieval self-care, swore by rubbing goose fat on the chest as a cure for coughs. Not goose soup, not goose feather pillows, just pure, oily, farmyard fat rubbed liberally onto the royal torso, preferably while lying on gold-threaded pillows and barking orders between wheezes. The logic, if you can call it that, was that the warmth of the fat would draw out the sickness, or possibly that the scent would drive the phlegm away out of sheer disgust. Either way, his physicians nodded solemnly, while frantically writing down, "Avoid being near His Majesty during cold season." You can just imagine the poor courtier assigned to hold the goose grease bowl while Henry derobed, coughed, and demanded to be basted like a Christmas roast. Medicine was less science and more hope mixed with whatever you had lying around. So if you've ever doubted the progress of modern healthcare, just be grateful no one's prescribed poultry rubdowns in the 21st century. And speaking of strange creatures in royal robes, Henry didn't stop at greasing himself. He also dressed his monkey like a tiny monarch. He had a pet monkey dressed in miniature royal robes. Because if you're already feeding your ego daily with roasted swan and musical applause, why not add a monkey in royal cosplay to the mix? Henry VIII had a pet monkey, a little capuchin or macaque we assume, dressed in miniature royal robes. This wasn't some petting zoo curiosity. This was a formal, fashion-forward primate who probably had better wardrobe options than most of Europe's nobility. It wasn't just for laughs, though you can bet everyone laughed nervously. Henry genuinely saw the monkey as an extension of his court, a living, furry doll that amused, shocked, and served as one more example of his untouchable wealth. The monkey reportedly had a wardrobe tailored to match the king's outfits, so you could witness Henry strutting through court, followed by his tiny doppelganger with a banana and attitude. No one dared question it. If the king wanted a monkey in ermine, you gave him one, probably with a jewelled leash. It was a spectacle of absurd luxury, but also oddly symbolic. After all, who better to reflect the chaotic energy of Henry's court than a primate in a doublet? Still, when it came to showing affection to actual humans, like Anne Boleyn, Henry had his own peculiar way of expressing love, including with jewellery shaped like crustaceans. Henry gave Anne Boleyn a jewel shaped like a crab, a royal inside joke. Romance, Tudor style. When Henry VIII wasn't busy rewriting England's religious landscape or composing love ballads, he was giving Anne Boleyn symbolic jewellery, like a jewel shaped like a crab. Yes, instead of the usual heart, rose, or discreet locket, he handed her a gem-encrusted crustacean, because nothing says I love you like the zodiac mascot of sideways movement and emotional mood swings, It was reportedly a private joke between them. Perhaps Anne was a cancer, or maybe Henry just enjoyed giving gifts that doubled as coded sass. The crab could have meant anything: affection, inside humour, or an eerily foreshadowed reference to how sideways their relationship would eventually go. Anne wore it proudly, of course. You don't refuse gifts from a king, even if they resemble seafood. And to be fair, it was probably made of diamonds and gold, and came with its own velvet box and potentially its own servant. But crab or no crab, Henry's way of showing devotion always had flair, right down to the napkins, embroidered napkins, with his personal motto, because nothing is sacred, not even your lap. He had special napkins embroidered with his personal motto. In most households, napkins are there to catch crumbs and wipe gravy from your chin. In Henry VIII's court, they were miniature banners of self-importance. The king had custom napkins, not just embroidered for decoration, but stitched with his personal motto, Cœur loyal, loyal heart, because even when you were dabbing mead foam from your lips, you needed to be reminded whose ego reigned supreme. Guests at Henry's feast didn't just get tableware, they got propaganda. Imagine reaching for a napkin only to find it reminding you of the king's loyal heart. Right before he sentences your cousin to the tower, subtlety was not the strong suit of a man who had monkey sidekicks and squirrel fur coats. Every detail at Henry's table was curated to reflect divine kingship and unmatched power, including the napkins. And yes, servants were expected to wash and re-embroider them constantly, because heaven forbid a guest see the motto smeared with pie filling. But Henry didn't just stitch slogans, he wrote them in an actual book about religion before completely changing his mind. Naturally, Henry wrote a book defending Catholicism and the Pope before breaking from both. Before he turned the English church upside down, Henry VIII fancied himself a theological authority. So much so, he wrote a book defending Catholicism and the supremacy of the Pope, Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, Defense of the Seven Sacraments, was published in 1521 and was so enthusiastically Catholic, it made the Vatican weep tears of Latin joy. In return, Pope Leo XI gave Henry the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Fast forward a few years, Henry's faith was still strong, in himself. When the Pope wouldn't annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry tossed the book, the marriage, and the Pope out the stained glass window of English history. He created the Church of England, declared himself its head, and rebranded Defender of the Faith to mean his faith, his rules, his interpretation. Because why defend a faith when you can just invent your own? It was the most dramatic theological U-turn in British history, and Henry didn't stop there. He brought that same brand of spiritual swagger to party games, like humiliating bishops. He once made a bishop serve him wine on all fours for a party prank. Forget pin the tail on the donkey. Henry VIII's party pranks involved clergy. At one particularly rowdy court gathering, he ordered a bishop, yes, a real bishop, to serve him wine while crawling on all fours like a tavern dog. And people say church and state were separate. The bishop, likely torn between religious dignity and keeping his head, complied. Guests howled with laughter. The king raised his goblet with royal satisfaction, because when you're the most powerful man in England, nothing says fun like humiliating a holy man over Bordeaux. This wasn't just mischief, it was dominance dressed as comedy. Henry loved turning solemn figures into punchlines. It reminded everyone who really held the power. You might wear a mitre, but if the king says bark, you bark. It was crass, theatrical, and deeply on brand. And after a night of such blessed revelry, one needs a hearty breakfast, preferably one soaked in wine, because of course, even his porridge didn't escape the royal booze treatment. His breakfast included ale, bread, meat pies, and sometimes porridge with wine. If your idea of breakfast is a light yogurt and some fruit, Henry VIII would have laughed in your face, then probably eaten your breakfast along with his own. His morning meal was a feast that could double as a medieval buffet. We're talking ale, meat pies, fresh bread, and, on days when he was feeling particularly regal, porridge drowned in wine. Because why rehydrate with water when you can turn your oats into a boozy slurry? The ale was the Tudor version of orange juice, rich in calories, low in sobriety. The meat pies, stuffed with anything from venison to swan, because even breakfast needed drama. And the wine-soaked porridge? Equal parts carbs and poor life choices. It wasn't just indulgence, it was policy. Henry believed a king should be strong, hearty, and well-fed enough to survive a minor siege before noon. Imagine waking up every day to a breakfast that would clog a horse's arteries. Now imagine doing that in full velvet robes, under golden canopies, because there was no way this man was walking to the dining hall in the rain. Henry hated rain so much he had canopies built between castle buildings. Henry VIII loathed rain, with a kind of theatrical disgust usually reserved for betrayal and bad wine. To combat the horror of dampness, he ordered canopies to be constructed between buildings at his castles, especially at Hampton Court, so he could stroll between his throne room and bedchamber without being touched by a single sinful droplet. This wasn't just some tarpaulin tent situation. These were grand, covered walkways with decorated ceilings, lined with tapestries and torches, because heaven forbid the king see a wet hedge on his way to supper. Servants had to test the paths before Henry used them, ensuring no puddles, no leaks, and definitely no surprise gusts. Rain wasn't just inconvenient, it was undignified. A king wasn't meant to be soggy. His beard had to remain fluffed, his sleeves unspotted, and his mood, well, less murderous. The result? A royal climate bubble, custom built for a monarch who demanded the weather bend to his will. And when he wasn't avoiding drizzle or drowning breakfast in booze, he was wagering his dignity over dice, poorly. He played backgammon for money, and he was a sore loser. Henry VIII loved a good game of backgammon. He also loved winning. Unfortunately, those two passions didn't always align, which meant that when the dice weren't in his favour, neither was his personality. He played for money, sometimes substantial sums, and if he lost, well, let's just say the room got very quiet, very fast. He was the kind of player who would accuse the dice of treason, the board of sabotage, the opponent of witchcraft. Losing at backgammon didn't just bruise his ego, it wounded the image of a divinely appointed monarch, and Henry didn't like being reminded that fate, much like his wives, could turn on him unexpectedly. Courtiers learned to accidentally lose at key moments. Others tried to keep a neutral face while Henry ranted about unfair roles. More than one noble probably asked themselves if winning was really worth being reassigned to a remote northern outpost. And if Henry lost 2 games in a row, it was probably safest to offer him something shiny, like a motto or a heart, or ideally both, embroidered on a sleeve no less. His personal motto was Cœur loyal, loyal heart, ironic, given his marriages. Ah yes, Henry VIII, the man whose motto was Cœur loyal, loyal heart, while simultaneously collecting wives like they were limited edition action figures. Declaring your unwavering loyalty while beheading your second wife and annulling the others takes a special kind of royal audacity. But hey, nothing says faithful like printing it in gold thread on napkins, armour, and, presumably, codpieces. This wasn't just a throwaway slogan. Henry had it embroidered, etched, engraved, and probably whispered dramatically into mirrors. It was his brand, his personal PR campaign, a walking contradiction wrapped in fur, dripping in jewels, and holding a divorce application. To Henry, loyalty meant something a bit more flexible. He was loyal to himself, to his throne, and to whatever woman he was currently courting. as long as she didn't age, disagree, or give birth to the wrong gender. But never mind the historical irony. Coeur Loyal looked fantastic in Gothic lettering, and if the motto didn't make you swoon, maybe his dazzlingly over-accessorized parade horses would do the trick. Henry had gold-threaded horse blankets made just for parades. Yes, even Henry's horses had better wardrobes than most nobles. For public parades, his steeds wore gold-threaded blankets, not for warmth, but for spectacle. Because if you're going to strut through town claiming divine right, your horse better shimmer like a chandelier on legs. These were not humble saddlecloths. They were opulent masterpieces, woven with metallic threads, often embroidered with royal crests, and possibly insured against jealousy. The horses looked like they were attending a royal wedding, not stomping through muddy streets. Courtiers were expected to admire the craftsmanship. Peasants were expected to gasp and grovel. Foreign dignitaries were expected to feel extremely underdressed. Henry believed that if his horses looked majestic, it reflected directly on him. And since his thighs were already showcased in skin-tight hose, why not gild the hooves too? But visual grandeur wasn't enough. The king wanted his kingdom to smell the part, specifically like a dessert tray inside a flower shop. He had rooms scented with crushed roses, cinnamon, and oranges. If you ever wandered through a Tudor palace and thought, why does it smell like medieval potpourri in here? You can thank Henry VIII. The king had entire rooms scented with crushed roses, cinnamon, and oranges, turning his living spaces into a Tudor-themed spa. This wasn't just for aesthetic pleasure. It was also based on the popular belief that sweet smells warded off disease. If the air smelled good, it was considered clean. So naturally, Henry demanded a blend of floral, spice, and citrus so strong it could stun a deer at 20 paces. Servants would scatter flower petals, burn orange peels, and grind cinnamon sticks into sachets or mix them with vinegar to cleanse the room. One can only imagine how pungent it got when combined with Henry's perfume, sweat, and a faint hint of roasted meat from earlier banquets. But he believed in surrounding himself with beauty, even if it had to be pulverized and thrown on the floor. Of course, when your digestion's a mess from all that meat and ale, no amount of rose petals can mask the grumpiness, especially when constipation enters the chat. Henry ate so much meat. He had severe constipation and was often grumpy about it. When your diet consists almost entirely of roasted swan, beef pies, and turkey legs consumed 2 at a time, your intestines are going to file a formal complaint. Henry VIII, culinary enthusiast and fibre avoider, ate so much meat that he suffered from chronic constipation and made sure everyone knew about it. Imagine being a court physician, summoned at dawn not for a fever or plague, but to discuss the royal bowel movements, or lack thereof. Henry's grumpiness became legendary during slow digestive days. His moods darkened, his temper flared, and nobles learned to tiptoe. The court probably had a secret prayer circle just to hope the king would finally go. Vegetables? Too suspicious. Grains? Optional. The king believed meat made men strong, so naturally he ate enough to make 12 men strong and one king extremely irritable. And when goose fat rubs didn't help, he resorted to medical advice that mostly involved bleeding, prayers, and vaguely scientific grimacing. Still, while his bowels may have been blocked, his taste in animals was rather adventurous. He collected exotic animals, including a lion and a porcupine. Because nothing says, I am a balanced and reasonable ruler, like housing a lion and a porcupine at court. Henry VIII had a thing for exotic animals. The rarer and more ridiculous, the better. He didn't just want pets. He wanted a private zoo that screamed, I can conquer nations and cuddle a hedgehog with ambitions. The lion was a symbol of power, naturally, and also of terrifying everyone who walked past the royal menagerie. The porcupine, A curious choice. Maybe he liked the spikes. Maybe he thought it was a mythical creature. Maybe it was just funny to see ambassadors try not to flinch while passing it. These animals weren't kept in pens behind the castle. They were paraded around, gawked at, and possibly dressed up, based on his monkey's track record. They were another status symbol in a court already bursting with gold, codpieces, and anxiety. And when it came to marriage alliances, Henry brought the same unique flair, especially with poor Anne of Cleves. Henry gave Anne of Cleves a badger fur muff as a wedding gift. If your marriage starts with a badger fur muff, you know things are going downhill fast. When Henry VIII met Anne of Cleves, he was famously disappointed, blaming her portrait, her looks, and probably the alignment of the stars. But before all that sourness, there was this oddly specific gift, a muff made of badger fur. Romantic, right? Was it warm? Absolutely. Was it charming? Debatable. Was it a subtle insult? Maybe. Henry was known for extravagant gifts, but this one felt more like, well, this is happening, so here's a dead woodland creature to warm your hands. Anne, ever the diplomatic one, probably accepted it with a forced smile and quiet horror. Henry's enthusiasm fizzled quickly, and soon he was calling the marriage off before they'd even finished the honeymoon meat pies. But the muff remains a strange symbol of their brief, chilly union, a marriage sealed with fur and immediately undone by awkward glances and royal regret. And if you think that was extravagant, wait until you hear what he gave his dogs. They weren't just pets, they were jewellery models. His dogs wore collars studded with jewels. In Henry VIII's court, it wasn't just the king who wore the bling. His dogs sparkled too. Yes, Henry's hunting hounds strutted around wearing collars studded with jewels, because nothing screams absolute monarchy like a spaniel with better accessories than your duchess. These weren't functional collars either. They didn't track the dogs or keep them leashed. They just looked expensive. Some were made of velvet, others of fine leather. All were decorated with tiny gems, golden buckles, and possibly a hint of royal ego. You can imagine a pack of perfectly groomed dogs running through Hampton Court, sunlight bouncing off their collars like mobile chandeliers, while Henry watched with satisfaction, probably thinking, yes, even my beagles are richer than France. Servants were assigned to brush, feed, and lightly compliment these dogs daily, and God help the groom who let one return from a hunt with a scratch on its collar. Henry didn't just pamper himself, he pampered everything within barking distance. And when the dogs weren't dazzling the courtiers, the king had another glamorous pastime, archery, with gold-trimmed targets, obviously. He had gold-trimmed archery targets at court for games. Because if Henry VIII was going to show off his archery skills, the bullseye better sparkle. His court featured archery targets trimmed with gold, not just painted or framed, trimmed, with actual shiny precious metal, because regular old straw circles are for amateurs and peasants, and Henry VIII was neither. This wasn't about function. The gold wasn't helping anyone aim. It was there to elevate a simple game into a glittering power move. Every arrow that hit those targets didn't just make a satisfying thud, it made a statement. The king has taste and access to way too much gold. Guests were invited to join in, but they knew the rules, missed too often, and Henry might accuse you of being French. Beat the king? Absolutely not. Let him win by a narrow margin and praise his technique like he just won the Olympics. Now that's how you survive a Tudor garden party. But archery and opulence were nothing compared to Henry's culinary experiments. Like that time, he tried to invent a dessert that belonged in a treasure chest. Henry once tried to invent a dessert made of wine, pears, and gold leaf. What happens when a monarch with a sweet tooth and zero restraint plays pastry chef? You get a dessert made of wine, pears, and gold leaf. Yes, Henry VIII once tried to create the ultimate Tudor treat by throwing together the most decadent ingredients he could think of. Boiled pears soaked in spiced wine, then draped in sheets of edible gold. It wasn't a recipe so much as a royal fever dream. The pears were stewed until tender. The wine was sweetened with sugar, cloves, and cinnamon. And then, just in case anyone forgot who was paying for the party, gold leaf was layered on top like frosting for the divine. Was it delicious? Maybe. Was it expensive? Absolutely. Was it necessary? Of course not. But that was never the point. This was dessert as status symbol, dessert as theatre. A bite of it probably cost more than your house. And somewhere between flambeing fruit and admiring his dog's collars, Henry decided this was the taste of royalty. But if the meal didn't impress you, the entertainment surely would, especially when it lasted 6 hours, featured jugglers, music, and enough roast boar to drown a small village. He loved banquets that lasted for 6+ hours, with music, plays, and acrobats. Henry VIII didn't just host banquets, he engineered marathons of gluttony and spectacle. Your average Tudor feast was a few hours of polite nibbling. Henry's, they went on for 6 hours or more, with music, theatrical performances, acrobats flipping through the rafters, and more roasted meat than a medieval cookbook on steroids. It wasn't just about food, it was full-blown sensory overload. You'd start with pheasant in almond sauce, move to swan stuffed with herbs, then finish with moulded sugar sculptures shaped like castles, or possibly Anne Boleyn's neck, depending on the day. Minstrels wandered between tables. Jugglers tossed flaming torches near priceless tapestries. Actors performed bawdy plays that made courtiers nervously laugh and sneak glances at the king. Henry sat on an elevated platform, feasting like a Roman emperor, barking out praise or groans depending on his mood and digestion. Everyone else had to pace themselves, not just with the food, but with the praise. Too little, and you were cold. Too much, and you were suspicious. But all the entertainment and feasting couldn't protect you from disease, unless, of course, you had the right gem. He believed wearing rubies warded off plague. Forget hand sanitizer. Henry VIII believed rubies were the ultimate pandemic prevention tool. In his royal mind, wearing a ruby close to the skin would protect you from the plague like a medieval force field. He wasn't alone in this. Tudor superstition held that certain gemstones had magical health properties. Rubies, in particular, were thought to darken in the presence of illness, which is a fancy way of saying they did absolutely nothing but look fabulous. Naturally, Henry had them embedded in his rings, sewn into his clothing, and possibly sprinkled across his toothbrush for good measure. If someone sneezed in the hallway, he'd clutch his ruby-studded chest and whisper a prayer to Saint Bling. It gave him peace of mind, more than the actual physicians ever could. And it meant that even in times of widespread death and despair, Henry was looking dangerously fashionable. Because why fear germs when you can just bedazzle your immune system? Of course, if the rubies failed and the plague still loomed, Henry had another cure: open a vein under the full moon. Obviously, he thought letting blood during full moons improved digestion. Yes, Henry VIII believed that if you wanted your roast boar to sit properly in your stomach, you should bleed yourself by moonlight. The logic, something about lunar cycles, humours, and the belief that your body functioned like a tide chart run by ancient astrology and really bad science. Doctors at the time, more barbers than scholars, advised that bloodletting during a full moon would balance the humours, improving everything from digestion to mood. So Henry, after downing an ocean of ale and 10 courses of meat, would have a physician slice open a vein just enough to rebalance things. Modern translation: medieval juice cleanse. This wasn't a one-time thing. Henry did it regularly. Full moon, time to bleed. Feeling bloated, time to bleed. Troubled by Anne Boleyn's eye contact? Yep, time to bleed. And while bloodletting by moonlight sounds unhinged, it was practically scientific compared to what came next. a royal astrologer who confidently predicted Henry would live to be 100. Spoiler alert, he did not. Henry had his own court astrologer, who once predicted he'd live to 100. Every great ruler needs someone to whisper comforting nonsense into their ear, and for Henry VIII, that person was his court astrologer. This stargazing yes-man was responsible for reading the heavens and assuring Henry that yes, the moon favours his war plans, Mercury blesses his marriages, and, most boldly, he'd live to 100. Spoiler alert, Henry made it to 55. Not bad for a man fueled by swan meat and wine porridge, but a bit shy of the astrologer's optimistic chart readings. Whether the stars were lying or the astrologer had a strong self-preservation instinct, the prediction was bold. After all, telling a notoriously moody king that he didn't have decades left to live could result in a much shorter forecast, like you have 30 minutes to pack before banishment. Henry took astrology seriously. He timed important events, military campaigns, and maybe even his dinner parties based on lunar alignments. And while the science was dubious, the pageantry was perfect. It gave him a cosmic sense of destiny, which, in Henry's mind, was just confirmation of what he already believed. The universe revolved around him. And speaking of the universe revolving around him, let's discuss how he had food cooked 4 ways at once. He once ordered a goose, cooked 4 different ways at once. Why have one roast goose when you can have 4 versions of the same goose simultaneously? At some glorious artery-defying moment in Tudor history, Henry VIII demanded that a single goose be prepared 4 different ways, at once. This wasn't indecision, it was ambition. The bird was likely boiled, roasted, fried and baked, or possibly drowned in a pie crust while singing madrigals. The point wasn't flavour, the point was power. The royal kitchen existed to obey, and Henry wanted his options open. Maybe he liked the drumstick crispy but the breast stewed. Maybe he wanted to eat a goose and also bully it posthumously through cuisine. Whatever the reason, the order was followed with the urgency of a military manoeuvre. Dozens of cooks probably wept while trying to synchronize temperatures and sauces. 1 goose, 4 fates, infinite pressure. The court watched in awe. The courtiers complimented the result, and you better believe they all laughed at his "this goose is cooked" joke, or else his courtiers were expected to laugh at his jokes or risk exile. Henry VIII considered himself hilarious, and when the king cracked a joke, whether it was actually funny or just a pun involving venison, you laughed loudly, enthusiastically, maybe a little tearfully if you valued your estate and your neck, because under Henry's reign, failing to chuckle was practically an act of treason. These weren't light-hearted chuckles either. They were forced guffaws from desperate courtiers who just watched a bishop crawl on all 4s, or heard Henry sing a song about swans mid-dinner. Even if the joke was about you, you especially had to laugh. Nothing made the king happier than public humiliation disguised as wit. Wit, after all, was power, and Henry wielded it like a sword made of sarcasm and turkey legs. If you couldn't keep up with his humour, you were out, sent to the countryside, the Tower, or worse, forced to organise the linens. The safe bet? Laugh until your ribs hurt, because the only thing more dangerous than laughing too little was outshining him with a better punchline. And if you thought that was petty, wait until you see his travel throne. Folding, portable, and unquestionably excessive, he had a special folding travel throne for long journeys. Some kings bring servants. Henry VIII brought a throne, a folding throne no less. Because ruling England wasn't something you just turned off when travelling. If Henry had to ride through muddy country roads or stop at a remote manor, he needed to sit in style. So, naturally, he had a portable royal seat crafted just for these glamorous pit stops. This wasn't some camping stool. This was a luxury contraption, probably made of gilded oak, velvet cushions, and hinges smoother than his political betrayals. The throne was carried by servants, unfolded like a monarch's pop-up tent, and placed precisely where the king needed to assert dominance. Be it on a battlefield, in a field of sheep, or right outside someone else's castle. Need to rest? Boom! Throne. Want to make a speech? Throne. Simply craving attention mid-journey? You guessed it. Deploy the throne. It was Henry's way of saying, yes, I'm travelling, but I'm still king, and I still deserve lumbar support. And after consuming 12 courses of heavily sauced meat, he really needed that back rest. Speaking of meat, Henry had a peculiar belief about how to finish a hearty meal. Hint, it involved fruit science from another dimension. He believed eating pears after meat could close the stomach. In the wonderfully inaccurate medical theories of Tudor England, Henry VIII believed that eating pears after meat would close the stomach. Yes, in his mind, your digestive system was apparently a drawbridge that needed sealing with soft, juicy produce. He wasn't alone in this belief. Tudor physicians often claimed that certain fruits acted like natural digestive gates, and Henry took it very seriously. After devouring half a deer and 3 pigeons in pie form, Henry would solemnly end the feast with a ceremonious pear, convinced it would lock in the meal and keep everything where it belonged. Think of it as Tudor Tupperware, but fruit-shaped and completely unscientific. Of course, eating fruit also soothed the royal conscience, because when you're eating 7 pounds of meat per sitting, 1 pear totally balances the scales, right? And when winter rolled in and the hunting horn blew through the frosty air, Henry made sure he was warm enough to chase down his next meal, with boots so fancy they could have attended court on their own. Henry had boots lined with ermine fur for winter hunting. Henry VIII didn't just go hunting, he went hunting fabulously. For winter expeditions, he wore boots lined with ermine fur, because clearly animal pelts are best enjoyed on your feet, while chasing other animals to become future pelts. Ermine was a symbol of royalty, purity, and luxury. Henry stuffed it into footwear like it was cotton wool for kings. These weren't just practical boots, they were foot thrones. Cozy, warm, and possibly monogrammed with little gold initials. His feet were the most pampered part of his anatomy, not covered by velvet codpieces. While his hounds shivered and his servants tripped over frozen puddles, Henry's toes were basking in silky ermine comfort. And as he rode through icy forests, one question echoed in the air. Who else but Henry would go full runway model for a deer chase? But even with fur-lined boots, a full belly, and a portable throne, there was always room for a little poetic flair, especially in his letters, where he didn't just sign off politely. He signed off lustily. He referred to himself in letters as Your Majesty's loving, lusty lord. If there was ever any doubt about how Henry VIII viewed himself, his sign-offs made it crystal clear, in letters, especially the saucy ones to his many love interests. He proudly referred to himself as Your Majesty's loving, lusty lord, because nothing says eternal devotion like combining royal authority with blatant thirst. Loving is sweet. Lusty is a choice. This wasn't some shy medieval flirtation. Henry wanted you to know that he was emotionally available and ready to rumble. This was a man who sent Anne Boleyn letters so spicy they could have been banned by the church. Oh wait, he banned the church. Courtiers had to act like this was totally normal. Secretaries transcribed these declarations of royal horniness with straight faces and clenched quills. The phrase became so iconic, you can almost hear the velvet rustle as he wrote it. But beneath the poetic libido, there was a king who also took hygiene very seriously, especially dental hygiene, with the kind of toothbrush that screamed, "My mouth is cleaner than your bloodline." Henry ordered custom toothbrushes made from horsehair and silver. Yes, Henry VIII brushed his teeth, and not with twigs or dirty rags like some commoner. No, he had custom-made toothbrushes crafted from horsehair and silver, because brushing was a royal ritual and only the finest materials could touch those royal molars. Horsehair was the bristle of choice, stiff enough to scrape off meat residue from an all-swan dinner, but gentle enough for sensitive monarch gums. The handle, ornate silver, possibly engraved with a crown, a motto, or something like "swine-free since 1509. It was a dental flex. Henry's attention to oral care might seem surprising, but image was everything. A king needed to smile without spinach in his teeth or pigeon feathers between his canines. Whether it worked is up for debate. Some accounts mention toothaches later in life. But you can't say the man didn't try. Of course, he wasn't just brushing for fresh breath. He needed those teeth ready for interrogations, because Henry believed he could spot a liar. With jewellery, he believed sapphire rings could detect lies. Forget polygraphs. Henry VIII believed sapphires were the lie detectors of the Tudor world. He wore rings embedded with gleaming blue stones, convinced they would vibrate, darken, or simply know when someone was feeding him falsehoods. If your voice quivered in court, Henry wasn't just watching your eyes. He was side-glancing his finger like it held the truth. This wasn't just a fashion statement. It was an early version of high-stakes mystical fact-checking. Sapphires were believed to repel poison, reveal treachery, and generally glow with divine truth. Naturally, Henry had several, probably one for each suspicious wife. Whether the stones actually changed colour is unclear, but they certainly gave Henry an added layer of confidence when delivering royal side eyes. "Are you lying to me, Duke of Norfolk? My ring says yes." And while he trusted jewellery to uncover deceit, he had a more interactive method for foreign diplomats, tricking them outright just to see how polite they could pretend to be. He played tricks on foreign ambassadors to test their manners. Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was also a chaotic prankster with a crown. When foreign ambassadors came calling, expecting polite conversation and stiff diplomacy, Henry would often play tricks on them, just to test their composure and see if they could fake a smile while internally panicking. Sometimes he disguised himself before meetings, pretending to be a lowly servant or randomly charming courtier. Other times, he served weird dishes, presented outrageous claims, or staged surprise theatrical performances in the middle of serious negotiations. Imagine arriving to discuss trade agreements only to be greeted by a lute solo, a wrestling monk, and Henry popping out from behind a curtain shouting, "Gotcha!" The goal, to observe their manners under pressure. Could they still flatter, bow, and pretend the situation was perfectly reasonable? Then they passed. If they flinched, frowned, or questioned the setup, they risked insulting the king, their country, and the entire concept of smiling through nonsense. Because in Henry's court, diplomacy wasn't just a chess game, it was also a talent show. And once the court stopped laughing at the ambassador's expense, it was time for something more soothing, like a royal bubble bath with herbs. He liked bathing with herbs like chamomile and mint. Henry VIII may have been a meat-devouring, wife-beheading, codpiece-wearing powerhouse, but deep down, the man loved a nice soak with chamomile and mint. Yes, his royal baths weren't just for cleaning, they were for steeping, like a giant Tudor tea bag. Servants prepared the bath with hot water poured from silver ewers, sprinkled in crushed herbs like chamomile to calm and mint to refresh. Sometimes rosemary was added for strength, or rose petals for scent, because if your bath doesn't look like a romantic picnic exploded in it, are you even monarching properly? Henry believed in the healing powers of herbal baths, especially as his body aged, ached, and occasionally collapsed under its own indulgence. The bath became his sanctuary, a place where ulcers could float, worries could melt, and courtiers were banned unless holding towels or compliments. And when he finally emerged from his fragrant spa time, robe billowing and skin lightly marinated, it was off to bed, or more accurately, off to his own private kingdom made of pillows. His royal beds were so big they could fit 8 people comfortably. Henry didn't just sleep, he reigned horizontally. His royal beds were so massive, so extravagant, they could fit 8 people comfortably. And that's not a hypothetical. These beds were used for royal business, royal intimacy, and royal lounging with a small army of attendants, dogs, and perhaps a monkey in pyjamas. The beds weren't just wide, they were architectural monuments, 4-poster masterpieces with carved dragons, embroidered canopies, and sheets so luxurious they probably had their own titles. These weren't for sleeping alone. Henry often held informal meetings from bed, surrounded by advisors, musicians, and occasionally wives auditioning for survival. The size of the bed wasn't just about space, it was about status. The king needed a bed big enough to contain his ego, his entourage, and his late-night roast turkey. If it didn't creak under the weight of glory, it wasn't worthy. And next to that enormous bed, a table, and on that table, a fork. Not just any fork, one specially crafted for eating one fruit and one fruit only. Pears, of course. He had a special fork made just for eating pears. Of all the royal utensils Henry VIII could have demanded, he chose to commission a special fork solely for eating pears. Not for meat, not for feasting, not even for ceremony. Just for those delicate, stomach-closing fruits he believed were the grand finale of every meaty meal. And naturally, this wasn't some simple dining tool. It was likely silver, ornately carved, and possibly engraved with something dramatic like Fruit of Kings. Pears were Henry's preferred post-roast digestive aid, and you don't just jab a royal pear with any old fork. Oh no. This was an elegant, possibly velvet-boxed, fruit-fondling implement that screamed, "I've never eaten with my hands and never will." Was it necessary? Not remotely. Was it fabulous? Absolutely. And you can bet courtiers noticed. If the king pulled out the pear fork, it was time to sit up straight and pretend you weren't already full from 3 courses of goose. And if the pears weren't up to snuff, don't worry. Henry would personally tell the chefs, with notes. Henry would inspect his chef's cooking daily and sometimes make suggestions. Henry VIII wasn't just a king. He was a micromanaging, culinary menace. The royal kitchens may have employed dozens of trained chefs, but that didn't stop Henry from inspecting the food daily and occasionally offering, let's say, feedback. And by feedback, we mean he'd hover, taste, wrinkle his nose, and casually suggest that maybe the roast swan should be less aggressive next time. He'd stroll into the kitchen like the head judge on a royal version of MasterChef, poking a meat pie here, sniffing a stew there, and probably declaring things like, "This lacks drama," or "Where's the lark garnish?" Some days, he might ask for a simple dish. Other days, a goose cooked 4 ways and served on a flaming pineapple. Metaphorically speaking, probably. No chef dared argue. Henry's palate was law. If he wanted his beef pie spicier or his custard to shine like the crown jewels, it was done. And sometimes he wouldn't even leave it to them at all. Because occasionally, the king liked to roll up his sleeves and whip up something himself. Salad dressing, Henry style. He made his own salad dressings, heavy on vinegar and sugar. Yes, Henry VIII, conqueror of appetites and monarch of meat, also dabbled in the delicate art of salad dressing, not just as a critic, but as a creator. And like everything else in his life, his version was bold, excessive, and probably flammable. The base? Vinegar and sugar. Lots of both. Forget subtlety or balance. This was a dressing that slapped your taste buds awake. The vinegar provided the aggressive punch, and the sugar followed like an apologetic knight. There may have been mustard, herbs, maybe even rosewater if the mood struck. But vinegar and sugar were the stars, because nothing says refreshing greens like a pickled dessert explosion. He mixed it himself, sometimes at the table, because why not turn lettuce into a power move? Servants watched nervously as he stirred and tasted, declaring it perfect, or too sour, too bland, or treasonously average. And when his sweetheart was at the table, he might drizzle it over her greens personally, especially if that sweetheart happened to be Anne Boleyn, his sweetheart with the little neck. You'll see, he referred to Anne Boleyn as my sweetheart with the little neck. Leave it to Henry VIII to give his beloved a nickname that's both affectionate and chillingly prophetic. He once referred to Anne Boleyn as my sweetheart with the little neck. Now, to be fair, at the time it might have sounded romantic. He was probably admiring her slender build or her graceful poise. But coming from the man who would later behead her, that phrase now echoes like a dark Tudor punchline. Anne herself reportedly joked that her execution would be easier because of that little neck displaying a gallows humour worthy of court life under a monarch who could love you one day and sign your death warrant the next. Henry's term of endearment became a gruesome footnote in the tragic arc of their relationship. It's as if he gave her a compliment, underlined it in red, then bookmarked it for future irony. Nothing says, "I'll love you forever," like pointing out the efficiency of future decapitation. And when he wasn't coining nicknames with a hint of doom, he was accessorizing with rings that roared. He wore a ruby ring shaped like a lion's paw. If you think Henry VIII was subtle about his power, then let me introduce you to his ruby ring shaped like a lion's paw, because wearing a regular ruby ring simply wasn't enough. No, he needed his jewel to look like it could maul someone on its own. The lion, of course, symbolized strength, courage, and royal dominance, qualities Henry believed he possessed in abundance, especially after a few tankards of ale. So why not put that symbolism right on his finger? The ruby glinted red like power, blood, or possibly leftover wine stains, and the paw design said, "Yes, I can crush you, politically and ornamentally." He flashed it during court meetings, diplomatic dinners, or any moment he felt like reminding people who was king of both England and fashion accessories. Some say he even used it to tap nervously on tables when plotting marital terminations. That's not confirmed, but it feels right. And if the royal rings didn't impress you, just wait until you saw the food. Because Henry's dinner came with a side of zoo-themed absurdity. Henry sometimes had his food carved into animal shapes for amusement. In case you thought Henry VIII's meals weren't theatrical enough, let it be known that he sometimes had his food carved into animal shapes, just for fun, because nothing enhances a meat pie like sculpting it into a goose, or turns a roast ham into a conversation piece like shaping it into a boar's head with pastry antlers. This wasn't just decoration, it was entertainment. Guests would gasp, laugh, or politely pretend to be amazed, while a life-size sugar swan rolled onto the banquet table, only to be ceremoniously sliced open and filled with custard. And yes, sometimes the food roared, mechanical effects, hidden steam vents. If he could have added fireworks, he would have. Henry turned dinner into performance art. There was symbolism in the shapes, lions for power, boars for valor, dragons for "I was bored and had too many cooks." No animal was safe from edible reimagination. And if you didn't compliment the craftsmanship, you might be next on the carving block. But beyond all the feasts and flamboyance, Henry believed food could do more than entertain. It could heal, especially if you played the right music during dessert. He believed music could cure headaches and would order string quartets to play. Most people reach for a cold cloth or some willow bark tea when a headache hits. Henry VIII, he called in the string quartets. The king firmly believed that music, particularly sweet, harmonious chamber music, had the power to cure headaches, soothe the royal brain, and maybe even keep the realm from collapsing under the weight of his mood swings. If Henry felt a throb coming on, musicians were summoned at once, often from their sleep or supper, to perform in hushed tones just outside his chamber. Lutes, viols, harpsichords, and whispered prayers filled the air as everyone hoped that a gentle sonata would succeed where actual medicine had not. Did it work? Unclear. But it certainly kept the king distracted and gave his staff enough time to hide anything that might further irritate him, like unpaid taxes, overcooked goose, or Anne of Cleves. And when music didn't work, he turned to his other comfort, inventing things, preferably things you could put on a roast. He invented a new type of sauce that became popular at court, based on sour cherries. Some rulers built cathedrals. Henry VIII, he built condiments. Among his lesser-known legacies is a sour cherry sauce he personally helped invent, which became a hit at court. Tangy, sweet, and probably drowning in sugar and wine, this sauce was drizzled over everything from venison to mystery meat to, quite possibly, breakfast pies. The recipe likely involved pounded cherries, vinegar, honey, and whatever spice was trending that week. It was designed to cut through the richness of Tudor feasting and prove, once again, that Henry didn't just consume food, he curated it. Chefs would nervously adjust their spice levels as the king loomed, ready to approve or excommunicate the sauce from his table. When he liked it, he praised it loudly. When he didn't, you were lucky to escape with your apron. But when he really liked something, there was no mistaking it. Like, say, turkey legs, lots of them, preferably in both hands. He liked turkey legs so much, he'd eat 2 at once, using both hands. The image of Henry VIII chomping into a giant turkey leg is so iconic, it practically defines his brand. But what most people don't know is that this wasn't just symbolic, it was habitual. The man loved turkey legs so much, he would frequently eat 2 at once, gripping one in each jeweled hand like the Renaissance version of dual-wielding cutlery. Imagine the scene. The banquet in full swing, goblets clinking, courtiers nervously pretending their pheasant is fine. Meanwhile, the king is going full carnivore, tearing into drumsticks like a medieval action figure on cheat day. Servants stood by with napkins, minstrels avoided eye contact, foreign envoys whispered in awe or fear, or both. Turkey was a relatively new delicacy in England, and Henry adopted it with the enthusiasm of a man who never met a meat he didn't want to conquer. It was indulgent, it was primal, it was Henry at his most Henry. And after polishing off twin legs of bird, he liked to sit back, belly full, in a room filled with lavender, because apparently the smell kept demons away. Naturally, Henry thought sitting in a lavender-scented room kept away evil spirits. You'd think Henry VIII, a man who split from the Pope and created his own church, might have let go of old superstitions. You'd be very wrong. This is the same king who genuinely believed that sitting in a lavender-scented room would keep away evil spirits. That's right. Demonic forces, curses, and spectral mischief were no match for a few sprigs of dried purple flowers and a good aromatic breeze. Lavender was crushed, boiled, burned, and stuffed into sachets that were hidden behind tapestries and under cushions. His chambers often smelled like an herbal spa mixed with fear of the afterlife. No ghost, it seems, dared face a king armed with God, gout, and potpourri. Whether it worked is debatable. What's certain is that servants spent an absurd amount of time airing out rooms and refreshing sachets. Also, Henry could sit smugly on his overstuffed throne and inhale victory over Satan. And speaking of spirits, if not the demonic kind, then the silly, drunken jester kind. Henry didn't just employ fools, he married them, to each other. Sort of. He held a fake wedding between 2 court jesters, complete with vows and cake. Because when you're king and you've already married 6 women, why not host a wedding for your jesters, Henry once staged an entirely fake marriage between two courtfools, complete with vows, a cake, and presumably the most chaotic guest list in Tudor history. This wasn't a quick skit. It was a full-blown ceremony, with the jesters dressed in absurdly ornate outfits, possibly stolen from the prop closet of a failed shepherd masquerade ball, a priest reciting nonsense Latin, and courtiers forced to act like this was perfectly normal. There may have been a banquet, there were definitely jokes, and it's likely someone ended up in a pie. Was this a prank? A test? A Wednesday? It's hard to say, but Henry was delighted, and when Henry was delighted, everyone laughed like their lives depended on it, because often they did. And for those lucky enough to make him laugh without even staging a mock wedding, there was a glittering reward for their trouble. He gave gold coins as tips for good jokes. Forget claps or chuckles. Henry VIII tipped with gold. If your joke landed well, if your timing was perfect, or if your jesterly roast didn't cross into dangerous territory, the king might toss you a shiny gold coin as a reward. It was the ultimate form of royal applause, and possibly more profitable than being a baron. This system encouraged peak comedic performance at court. Fools, poets, and brave nobles would sharpen their wit daily, hoping to strike golden laughter. But it was a double-edged jest. Make the king laugh, you're rich. Make the king frown, you're redecorating the dungeons. There are accounts of jesters practically juggling for joy after being paid mid-performance, and of nobles awkwardly testing puns during banquets just to score a bonus. Because when the king's wallet is as loose as his grip on monogamy, even one perfectly timed fart joke could finance a summer estate. And if you think tipping for jokes was extreme, wait until you see how many people Henry had tasted his food. Spoiler, more than a banquet, a lot more. Henry had over 60 official taste testers during his reign. Henry VIII was many things: musician, monarch, meat enthusiast, and paranoia connoisseur. So it's no surprise that he kept over 60 official taste testers during his reign. 60, because when you execute people for breakfast and rewrite the church for lunch, poisoned dinner becomes a very real concern. Each meal was pre-sampled by an elite squad of culinary canaries. From roast peacock to pear soup, someone else took the first bite while Henry observed closely, probably with a raised eyebrow and a hand hovering over his jewel-encrusted fork. If the tester keeled over, well, no supper for the king and probably a quick manhunt for the chef. The testers rotated, and the higher ranking the meal, the more testers were involved. Even the wine was sampled in advance, and the platters were sometimes sealed with wax to prevent tampering. Imagine living your life as a full-time nibble-for-your-life professional while Henry VIII chewed in comfort 30 seconds later. Still, no one dared complain. It was an honour, a terrifying, ulcer-inducing honour, and if you survived long enough, you might even be asked to try his latest culinary passion, mustard, but not just any mustard. He tried to make king's mustard a national dish. Because when you've already created your own church and your own sauce, why not invent your own national condiment? Henry VIII introduced king's mustard, his personal blend of spices, vinegar, and ambition, and tried to turn it into the official flavour of the realm. This wasn't the mild yellow smear we know today. King's mustard was bold, tangy, and aggressively assertive, much like its creator. Some recipes included horseradish, others had cloves or cinnamon. All of them burned your nose hairs and screamed, "I have a codpiece and I'm not afraid to use it." Henry would smear it on venison, swan, beef pies, possibly pears. He was obsessed. Courtiers were expected to praise its flavour like it was a divine revelation. Foreign guests were forced to taste it, smile through watering eyes, and declare it better than French mustard, or risk a diplomatic incident. He even had barrels of the stuff stored in the palace kitchens and encouraged nobles to serve it at home. It didn't exactly catch on nationally, but you've got to admire the condiment confidence. And while he was trying to season his kingdom, he was also keeping a very close eye on time, literally with a personal clock guy. He had his own personal clockmaker on staff to adjust his sundials. In an age when most people told time by staring at the sky and hoping for the best, Henry VIII employed his very own personal clockmaker to maintain and adjust his sundials. Because when you're running an empire, 6 wives, and a full banquet schedule, punctuality is power. This wasn't just some handyman with a wrench. This was a highly skilled artisan whose sole job was to make sure Henry's elaborate sundials and early mechanical clocks were accurate, regal, and sufficiently dramatic. Some of these timepieces were architectural wonders, embedded with astrological symbols and Latin inscriptions. Because why just know it's 3 p.m. when you can also feel like Caesar while checking it? And heaven help the man if Henry thought the hour was wrong. A late meal, a mistimed sermon, or, God forbid, a misplaced hunting call could result in an eruption of royal rage. The clockmaker was essentially the king's anxiety sponge, constantly tweaking, aligning, and polishing the flow of time to match Henry's schedule. Because when you're Henry VIII, even time must obey, preferably in gold leaf and hourly chimes. And speaking of golden drama, let's talk about what he wore to truly peacock around court. Purple velvet and actual bird feathers. Yes, really, he once wore purple velvet with real bird feathers sewn into it. Subtlety was not in Henry VIII's vocabulary, especially when it came to fashion. So one day, just to really hammer home the fact that he was not your average monarch, he stepped out in a full suit of purple velvet, already a colour reserved for royalty, and had actual bird feathers sewn into it. Because what's better than looking like a king? Looking like a flamboyant bird king hybrid with access to unlimited haberdashery. This wasn't just an outfit, it was a statement. A moving, swishing, flapping display of wealth, power, and questionable design choices. The feathers reportedly came from exotic birds, so the ensemble was equal parts peacock, parrot, and possible avian crime scene. Courtiers were expected to marvel and definitely not ask, "Majesty, is that molting?" The look was likely worn for a masquerade or public feast, but knowing Henry, it could have been a Thursday. After all, the man once built a parade float of himself. At this point, dressing like a feathered carnival attraction was almost restrained, and if the outfit didn't impress you, wait until you hear his logic for pre-game drinks, especially when those games involved weapons. He believed drinking wine before hunting improved his aim. While most people might stretch, hydrate, or practice before picking up a crossbow, Henry VIII preferred to down a goblet of wine first. Why? Because he believed it improved his aim. That's right, the same man who passed laws, created a church, and redefined royal marriage also thought a little buzz gave him Hawkeye-level accuracy. This wasn't a one-time indulgence. It was a pre-hunt ritual. Before charging into the forest with his jewel-studded hunting dogs, Henry would enjoy a few generous sips, or gulps, of his favourite red, claiming it steadied the hand. What it probably did was turn every squirrel into a moving target, and every noble into a duck and cover enthusiast. Still, who was going to tell him otherwise? He had over 200 deer killed in a single year. The wine either helped, or everyone else learned to get out of the way very, very quickly. And while Henry could hit a stag at 50 yards, allegedly, he also knew how to terrify intruders without lifting a finger. Thanks to a rather eerie wax twin, Henry VIII had a life-sized wax figure of himself made to scare intruders. Because locking your doors like a normal person was far too mundane, Henry VIII commissioned a life-sized wax figure of himself to be placed in his chambers, to scare off would-be intruders. Yes, he created a medieval security decoy in his own image, complete with regal attire, stern expression, and probably an aggressively large codpiece. The idea that any nighttime trespasser creeping into the room would see the imposing silhouette of the king standing there and immediately rethink their life choices, or faint, or wet themselves, or all three. The wax figure was reportedly so realistic that even servants occasionally bowed to it by accident. Whether it was ever successful in actually stopping a crime is unknown, but the vibe was clear. I'm always watching, even when I'm technically melting. It was theatrical, unsettling, and very on brand for Henry. Because if you can't rule through fear, paranoia, and a waxy glare, are you even king? And with that final waxy mic drop, we conclude our 99 ridiculous facts about Henry VIII, the man who ruled England like a Renaissance rock star with a meat addiction, trust issues, and a flair for feathered drama.